Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about Kenneth Frampton and architecture history. This is a different kind of episode, but one that I enjoyed quite a bit. Over the last few years, I've interviewed dozens and dozens of architecture and design critics and writers and historians. But this is an episode that's actually about an architecture critic. This episode is all about the legendary architect, writer, teacher, critic, historian, Kenneth Frampton. I'm joined today by Karla Britton and Robert McCarter, the editors of a fascinating new book, Modern Architecture and the Lifeworld, Essays in Honor of Kenneth Frampton. To celebrate Frampton's 90th birthday just this past November, Robert and Karla published this book with Thames and Hudson that's just packed with essays that respond to, expand upon, are in dialogue with, and are in honor of Frampton and Frampton's work. If you are in architecture, Frampton's work needs no introduction. His books on architecture, history, and theory are on the shelves of countless architects around the world, and his influence as a teacher and as a promoter of the sometimes overlooked architects has truly inspired and influenced a generation of architects, and honestly has shaped much of the architecture discourse. As someone outside of architecture, just outside of architecture, I was only somewhat familiar with Frampton's work. I knew who he was and I had read a few of his essays, but what I'm embarrassed to admit is how little I understood the range of his thinking. Frampton truly saw architecture as connected to everything else, to politics, to economics, to the environment, to culture. And his writing connected all of those things. He was writing about environmental issues, women in architecture, and the political dimension of the built environment long before it was popular. So in this episode, I talk with Robert and Karla about Frampton and about Frampton's work. We talk about his influence on the profession, why he always referred to himself as an architect who writes, and where he developed his critical positions. We also talk about how this book came together and what they hope to do with it. It's a great conversation. If you are not familiar with Frampton's work, hopefully we'll provide you a way in to this incredible body of work. In many ways, he is kind of the epitome of what we've been talking about when we talk about design criticism over the last couple of years. Don't forget, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listener support. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. These memberships help keep the show going, and members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the director's commentary for the show. It includes reflections on the episodes, bonus content, exclusive interviews, and all sorts of other fun things. If you want to help the show, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider becoming a member. You can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members for all the details. Thanks again for listening, and here is my wonderful conversation with Karla Britton and Robert McCarter. I want to start by talking a little bit about the origins of this book, this project. You have this newish book, Modern Architecture and the Lifeworld, Essays in Honor of Kenneth Frampton, and it's a really kind of fascinating project, and I think it's hard enough to get a book published about architecture and design criticism these days. I think it's even harder to have a book that is kind of about or in honor of another architecture or design writer. In your intro, you called the book an act of resistance. Can you talk a little bit about where this book came from, or where this project came from, and kind of how it got started?
Well, I think from the start, we received some, raised eyebrows about doing a project that many people thought was somewhat anachronistic. That is a kind of sustained celebratory piece of writing that honors the work of Kenneth Frampton. And I think many people thought that that kind of project is at odds with the very fleeting character of public discourse today. And so, I think from the get-go, the project was based on this idea that we had to, convince people from the start that our ambitions were larger than just paying honor to Ken. That in some ways, the project really sets out to trace a terrain of debates, of discourses in architecture that that has happened over the last 4 decades, and it does seek to address challenges that I think we feel architects will continue to confront in the future. So yeah, so from the get-go, I think there was this idea that we needed to address what some people would call kind of an outmoded project of the Festschrift.
Of course, there's also the fact that Kenneth Frampton has produced an enormous number of books,
Right.
and we were well aware that in order to honor him, it would be worth trying to have a book that could be added to this. And what's interesting is that the book as a kind of festskrift, which is often a kind of festival of writing in honor of someone, whether they're retiring. In this case, it had to be to do with thought about doing something for his 90th birthday, which was this November. But the notion of a book, I would say, is a bit of an act of resistance at this point. But it's an act of resistance that feathers in very well with his own belief in the power of books
Right.
and his participation in a sort of innumerable books that he's made some kind of contribution to over the years in terms of writing them or writing forwards and other his I mean, his activity has really shown that books still have a power, even in the ever increasing rise of the digital world. That books have a kind of power to create discourse and or a space for discourse around the book. So we felt, because there were, of course, there could be many ways that his 90th birthday and other kinds of events in his life could be celebrated, but we thought this would be the most appropriate for us to take on.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. You have a line. Somebody has a line in the book, and I forget who said it. It might have been in your introduction. I'm sorry, I can't remember. I didn't make a note of it, about how it's almost rare for there to be an architecture book that doesn't have a Kenneth Frampton intro in it than one that does.
Well, actually, it's a little more pointed than that. It actually is. What's the definition of a rare book in
Right.
architecture? It's a book without a Kenneth Frampton forward
Right.
or introduction.
Right.
So, I mean, it was actually, because I was around when that was first coined, and it was meant to have an edge to it, because it was true that there really wasn't anything sitting on the shelf in a bookstore that didn't have his name somewhere in it.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. So I have a couple questions in that answer that I'd like to kind of pull out and talk about a little bit more, but I think just, this, I imagine most of the people who listen to the show are familiar with Kenneth Frampton and his work, but there are listeners across all kind of fields of design. So just to frame this a little bit, can you talk about who Kenneth is, and also why he deserves this honor, or what it was about kind of his work and writing that helped kind of jumpstart this project?
Well, I mean, just I think a very simple definition is that he is this respected scholar, teacher, a practitioner, somebody who has created a lifetime of work about the act of building as as really a project, as a matter of really important cultural significance. And given this very expansive body of work and his, I don't know, 5 decades of teaching, he has really, I think, impacted so many individuals in the architecture world and its related fields. And the book, I think, is in part a means of trying to call attention to really the expansiveness of his thought, the way that he saw or understands architecture as being about all things, politics, and craft and the local context and global development and certainly landscape and
Mhm.
technology. And given the breadth of that interest, he is an individual who I think has been able to touch uh, the lives of people in all different
Mhm.
fields. And I think, too, he is very much a public intellectual.
Right.
So he's somebody who, I think is very aware of the power of being able to represent or articulate a message to the public about the importance of the built environment. And that role of public intellectual is really reinforced by uh, his outspokenness, his engagement with the world, certainly his scholarship, and a word that keeps coming up again and again is his generosity. I think his
Mhm.
generosity in sharing his ideas with students, the way that he is able to connect with people from all different kinds of backgrounds, and in that way, he is, I think, quite a unique type of intellectual because he has really provided many of us with the tools to think with, and that's been extremely valuable.
Yeah, I would add also that his output is quite broad in the sense that he's the author of the best-selling history of modern architecture in the world. I don't even know that it's how many languages it's been translated to, but I think it's approaching 40 or 50.
Mhm.
And then it's come out in its fifth edition, which he says will be the last, but you never know. Actually, also by Thames and Hudson at this time, at the same time, which is an interesting coincidence.
Mm.
Um, and that book of is a, a part of, I would say, I mean, very few architecture students around the world at some point that don't have that book as part of their education. But then he's also written a series of books and essays, like the critical regionalism
Mhm.
essay, as well as the studies in tectonic culture, which are also used in schools, but I think that they have had an equal or perhaps greater impact on the profession, um, in that what he has done, particularly in the tectonic culture book, is to reframe how it is that architects, practicing architects, which he considers himself to be one of, how they view history, because they don't view history in the same way as people trained in classical art history. They actually view it from the point of view of how the made object and the way that it's made can articulate a certain position and can embed itself in the life world in terms of how we experience it. Um, and that's a sort of an analytical approach based in experience that is just largely absent from more, I would call, sort of distanced modes of apprehension and analysis. And I think it's also led to the fact that he has, across his career, sought out architects whose work was of a very high quality, but were often overlooked
Mhm.
in the sort of stylistic or sort of journalistic structure of critique. And I would mention people like Alvaro Ziza, who went on to win the Pritzker Prize. But when he was first written about by Frampton, almost no one knew him outside of, I would say
Mm.
no one, in fact, knew him outside of Portugal, and he still practices in Portugal pretty much in the same way he always did.
Mm.
Um, but you could name many, many other architects. So there's also a sort of proactive uh, approach in the sense that he wants to highlight sort of practices that he thinks actually have a lot of merit and a lot of promise as a kind of model for other practices or model. So there is this creative aspect to it, I guess you could say, or a constructive aspect, which is
Yeah.
much more like the mind of an architect. And of course, he's very upfront, and we put it early in the essay in the introduction of the book that he thinks of himself as an architect who writes, where he
Right.
writes from the point of view of an architect, even though his practice has been relatively minimal and mostly towards the beginning of his career. It is true that when we were all at Columbia together, Karla and I and Kenneth, all sharing one small suite of offices in the 80s, that Kenneth took a year off and worked for Richard Meyer as what he called a geriatric retrainee. Humbly called himself. I know this because my wife was working with Richard at that time, and they had a lot of interaction in the office. But I asked him at one point why he would do that, at that age, and he said, I don't understand. I'm beginning to lose track of how contemporary buildings are actually put together, the really complicated ones. And he would call me from Meyer's office certain days, and he would say, I can't believe what's in the floor package. What's between the floor and the ceiling of a typical sort of contemporary office building. He said, I just can't believe what's there. It's just like a kid, he's just learning all again. And it just isn't that level of engagement and his ability to come at it almost like he's a green architect again, so to speak.
Right.
I mean, green in the old sense of the term. I think it's one of the unique things. It's why his criticism and his whole approach is always fresh, I think, and I think very willing to laugh at himself, and and to sort of a little bit sometimes even make fun of the or sort of bat away the sort of notion that he has any real power. He finds it kind of humorous sometimes, but I think that's why the book actually has quite a number of architects who've written, which is not at all normal for these kinds of books, I would say. Normally sort of the province of the historians and the critics, and there are very good ones in the book of those types as well, but you have a lot of architects, and this was just the tip of the iceberg of the architects that we could have included that would consider the impact of his writings on their work, whether directly by his promoting their work, so to speak, or writing about it like he did about Ziza's work, or whether they, like Brad Clofield talks about, that they encountered him at the university, and then basically the ideas from tectonic culture and critical regionalism were put into play in the work in a conscious way in the work of the office.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea of him considering himself an architect who writes. But while you're talking about the architects who contributed to the book, I do have a question about that kind of editorial process, because something, Robert, that you also said earlier is that, and Karla, you were saying this as well, that this was not meant to be. This wasn't meant to kind of promote celebrity or promote his identity in some way, but really in dialogue with his ideas, which I think really comes through in the book. And I was surprised how many practicing architects contributed. Can you talk just briefly about kind of how you selected the contributors that you did, and how you've kind of found that balance between both honoring him, but also kind of expanding on his ideas and furthering his ideas, and having essays that are, it's interesting, the range of pieces, because there are kind of responses to his work. There's work that's about him. There's pieces that are influenced by him. How did you kind of think about how all that comes together?
We worked on the book for around 10 years, but maybe only the last 3 years with a great intensity. But we started with something like 100 and some names. I don't remember. Karla actually had the first list. She probably could pull it up. But and then, of course, we realized that we'd left another 500 off the list, and because it's an impossible task. And then, of course, the publisher had other ideas about the number of people that might be involved in the book once we came to the publisher. But I think what we wanted was a range. We did not, well, I guess in a couple of cases, we made a sort of slight suggestion of what people might do, in particular with the architects. If they didn't have if they didn't sort of jump at the thing with an idea, which many of them did. Many of them didn't really need any direction, but we suggested it would be helpful in some cases to have an essay that covered certain areas, and that was true a little bit through the book, but most of the essays actually were what the authors felt would be the appropriate way for them to honor Kenneth. And some of them, are writing about things that or work of architects that I'm not sure Kenneth is particularly supportive of. It's more sort of showing the fact that he has a range. He engages everything that's out there in the built life world, whether he thinks it's an appropriate way to do or not. He realizes it's built, it's in the world, one has to deal with it. And so that's one of the reasons the book has such an enormous range. And you have people like, well, should we mention names, but maybe not on the podcast? I don't know. It's up to you. But you have Robert A.M. Stern, but you also have the Grafton architects. And so you have people that I don't believe would normally appear together in the book, if I may say so. Or even Kenneth and Stern, even though they were colleagues for many, many years at Columbia and have high regard for each other, but they have crossed swords seriously, which we make small reference to, and even Bob has made some reference to. But the actual sort of process of winnowing down, we could talk about that. That's really not something that there's a lot of happenstance and other things that happen.
Right.
The fact is that our idea was that this should be the book that Karla and I could do the way it would be something that we could do and maybe other people might not be able to do, but that we hoped would be, and we sort of suggest that in the acknowledgments, that we hope that this will stimulate other people to say, well, but there's other things that need to be said and there's other people that need to be involved, and that is for sure. And I do know that, just shortly before our book came out, there was a publication by the OASE group. Is that it, Karla, out of the Netherlands, the Delft University group? Mm-hmm. And it was actually a retrospective look back at the impact of critical regionalism as an essay, just that one essay. And there is also another group of essays to be published next year or fairly soon, edited by a former student of Kenneth, but also mine at the University of Florida, who's collecting together essays of Kenneth that have actually become rather hard to get, sort of maybe not the most well-known, but other essays that have been out of print for a number of years, and trying to put them forward as a kind of reader. And they were not the essays that Ken might have selected for his own essay book, which he did with Fiden a few years ago.
Right.
But that just shows the fact that even his sort of maybe what he doesn't think of as the most important contributions or the most memorable ones are still of great importance to many practicing architects and also scholars and teachers.
I just wanted to add that, I think we did, as Robert has said, we aimed really to cast a very wide, a wide net representative of, colleagues, architects, former students, and also people that would represent different parts of the globe, certainly Japan, France, Finland, Spain, Russia. We were also wanting very much to show his convictions about landscape architecture, architectural theory, urbanism, even architectural photography. So all of this, I think, was a bit of a factor in trying to do this impossible task of choosing who would be contributing. So, I think there could be many other volumes that would be equally persuasive about his his contributions, but but that this one really set out to try and talk about as much as possible from these various perspectives, his commitment to various areas of or discourses that he's been so committed to.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so interesting, both about your book, but also just about him generally. And, I'll admit, as not being someone who studied architecture or has ever worked in architecture, frankly, but, is a reader of him and of people like him, purely as a fan, really. not really directly related to the work that I do, aside from talking to people on this show. But what struck me was the range of interests that he had and the expansiveness of what he considered architecture writing. And Karla, you mentioned this very early on, that he was writing about politics and ecology and economics, and he kind of connected these things to cultural identity and labor, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting to think about him and to think about your book as not just your book is not just a book that's kind of in honor of him, but in a way, because he is so prolific and wide ranging in his interests, that it kind of also seems to trace a recent history of architecture discourse, and so much of the things he was writing about years ago are now kind of very much more common in the discourse. And I'm curious if you can kind of situate him in the kind of history of architecture writing and criticism and discourse, and how he kind of changed that, or the subjects that he started to kind of popularize that are now commonplace.
I mean, I would, and I'm sure Robert has his own thoughts on this, but I think his focus on really the ecological dimension of architecture was very pronounced early on in his work, and his concern with urbanization as integral to our understanding of the landscape. Um, these are themes that I think are much more prevalent now, and I think he was one of the first pioneers really to begin to talk about the ecological nature of architecture. And also, I think he was one of the first historians to pay close attention to women, and that comes up, I think, in a number of the pieces in the book. That he was very supportive of looking at women in architectural practice long before it became uh, kind of mainstream.
I think it's also that Kenneth has a very integrated view, and that's actually rare, which is
Mm,
which is not a good thing. But this integrated view that that architecture is an incredibly complicated business, and that it is so entangled in the life world that you can't say, well, let's just discuss the style, or let's talk about brutalism, or let's talk about this
right.
or that. You, I mean, he can cross swords with the best of them on that if you want, but the fact is that he doesn't seem to have much interest in that, because he wants to really talk about things. How in the world do you solve this difficult problem of making a building that will be appropriate to its time, that will continue into the future, that will have connections to the past, that will be appropriate for its particular context, that would actually even possibly
Mm-hmm.
uplift a certain way, or at least acknowledge and give space for a certain way of living. And he talked. By the time when I first met him and worked with him, I was a post-professional student at Columbia, and he was just beginning to start formulating what would become the critical regionalism.
Mm,
Um, and then during a little bit later in the same process, he started working on the tectonic culture. But and for him, there were ways to frame architecture that would take the discourse away from the stylistic, or what he felt was a purely stylistic or formal discussion that was happening in terms of postmodernism, or at least
right.
historicist postmodernism. And of course, it came to a head exactly the year that I came to Columbia in 1980, 81, when he had his, he dropped out of the Biennale, when it became clear it was just going to be a celebration
Right.
of kind of stylistic architecture that, virtually disconnected from any cultural, political, social, economic issues, and just be sort of set adrift. And he just basically said, I can't even be part of this as a critic in a certain sense. I can't, because it would seem as a kind of endorsement. And
Right.
and for him, I think that was, at the time, I just thought it was a natural thing that would be the way he would choose to go. But now from a different, looking back in retrospect, I think he sees that as a key turning point in his criticism in the sense that it's time that he needed to be more activist at a certain sense, a certain level. He had to be more proactive to make a statement, not just, okay, this historicist architecture is not good, or we shouldn't be doing it, but what else should we be doing? What's wrong? What are we missing? What do we need to be doing? And he actually began to construct a quite logical series of responses. And critical regionalism, of course, had it for an essay had an
Yeah.
enormous impact, and people still talk about it, and young people still talk about it. Because it reads very freshly, especially given that, as Karla said, a lot of the points he raised go directly to the issue of energy use and appropriate environmental response, and the engagement of landscape as a constructive and way to redress certain environmental wrongs of the past. But he also, I think, with tectonic culture, at least I've argued that he basically gave us a new way of looking at history, a way that has to do with the kinds of decision that the architect makes at the drawing board or at the computer. The notion that, we're not sort of stylistically flipping through books, or at least the vast majority of us are not. We have to make certain decisions about what's available in the way of technology. How can we build? As Lucan said, we want to make the building be kind of eternal.
Right.
But we have to deal with the circumstances. And Ken is absolutely amazing with understanding the difficulty that Khan talked about a lot, the real difficulty of how you can make anything of quality out of the circumstances that you've been given the way that society has decided to structure itself, and to sort of support certain kinds of activity and not support other kinds of activity. And so in that sense, I do think that Ken always has seen his writing as being resistant to certain typical modes of economic and social and cultural definition that he feels is not appropriate. I mean, the word appropriate is more mine than his, maybe, but that is part of his, or he sees as part of architecture's métier.
Yeah. I mean, do you have a sense of that, where that kind of activist lens came from? I mean, in the book, and in your book, that you talk about him kind of reading Hannah Arendt and that having a big impact on him. But it's interesting how so much of his writing does, and way ahead of his time in some regards, pushes against this kind of stylistic way of talking about architecture, and truly is a type of activism in promoting ideas, whether they are environmental, whether it is about kind of promoting women, or architects who are kind of outside of the kind of core of the discourse, or the modern project, if you want to call it that. Where did that come from? I mean, because it seems like it was there really early on. Do you have a sense of kind of where that lens developed for him?
I just want to underscore that I think it came early on from his convictions about the importance of public space. And part of that came from his faith in the British socialist project as
Right.
he knew it. It certainly came from Hannah Arendt and her book, The Human Condition, which he says, is a book that he will probably never be able to escape.
Yeah.
And, just this conviction that he has that architecture is somehow about bringing people together, that it has a very strong and political dimension, that public space is, very important to our society, and and therefore to the architectural profession. And in some ways, I think it's this the questions that he's raising about public space today, when so much is happening virtually because of the pandemic. I think he's at the moment very concerned about the way that Zoom is now our ways of gathering, and I think he sees that as very inadequate in many ways. That as he says, spontaneity is really inhibited by Zoom, and so much of our life is compromised by Zoom, and he has this great reluctance to meet virtually. So in a way, I think that this conviction about public space was essential to his to shaping his worldview early on. And then I just, wanted to talk a little bit too about what Robert was saying about his. I don't know. I don't think it was the word was synthetic, but somehow the way that he's able to draw many different threads into his thinking, teaching, and writing. And I know that in my early formation, he was always telling me about the importance of a dialogical mode of thought.
Mhm.
And I think that comes up again and again as his modus operandi, in a way that he's always moving between larger concepts regarding how we should live in the world, and what a nation is and what a society should do
Mhm.
for its people, and yet at the same time he's putting that in dialogue with how actual practitioners function, and about what he calls the poetics of construction and the adequate handling of materials. So, he's always moving back and forth between material evidence and these larger, bigger questions facing us.
I think this is a really important point too, of what to reinforce what Karla said. First, I think he was formed very early, and I think, and this is all before I knew him, but the experience in the UK at school and also at the AA, but also after school. I mean, he had the Smithsons as teachers, and then the work that was being done, and of course at that time it was quite an activist profession in the UK. They were building a huge amount of public housing, the London Housing Authority and such. And his
Right.
involvement in that it set a sort of expectation on his part that the larger society and government was involved in a proactive, positive way in making life better for the general community. And of course, he's the first one to trace really sort of frighteningly the sort of fall of that whole idea in Britain and the rise of Thatcherism, and which would be the exact opposite. And then
Right.
inability to ever return to that. But I think it formed him in a way that when he came to the U.S. and confronted the sort of ecological sort of
Yeah.
nightmare of the Northeast, in his first exposure when he first came to teach at Princeton, and then having a rent in New York and giving lectures at the New School, which he was able to attend. In addition to reading her book, he was able to be part of those discussions in some way while he was teaching at Princeton and also at Columbia. I think that makes an enormous difference, and I think that the short but I think very important period that he practiced with Douglas Stevens and the kind of people that he met in that office and the kinds of work that they did sort of set the table for his ability to interact with architects. And I think this synthetic notion that which is a good term, integrative, I think also another, the way that he's able to move back and forth from the largest social questions, which when you confront a working architect with these sort of bigger issues, it's just, well, what am I supposed to do with that? But then he moves right back down the scale and he talks about how do you make a door handle? And how do you make a kind of, like, someone like Alto or someone makes a door handle that basically gives you a kind of a response when you grip it that sort of unravels the whole building for you and sort of puts everything into place. And he's able to move back and forth the way you have to as an architect. That's what's critical. And most critics choose to stay, I would say, at one end of that spectrum, and the architects are just left with, well, this is all good for reading in school, but what is this? It's difficult to make a decision. You have a limited budget. You have your client has certain demands, and that's what Kahn called the circumstances. And I think Frampton has been hugely helpful in giving architects a kind of framework in which to grapple with these realities that still allows a kind of idealism and a kind of proactive, positive notion about making the world a better place, which underlies all his writings.
I think that's exactly right. And you started answering exactly where I wanted to take this conversation into. It's kind of my final couple questions because I wanted to come back to this idea that he still thinks about himself or refers to himself as an architect who writes. And as I told you, kind of my background before we started recording, that's kind of similar to my own experience as somebody who's a designer who also writes. And I'm interested in how that identity shapes the writing, or how he maybe approaches both of these positions. The importance of still thinking of himself as an architect, but also as a writer or theorist. And I guess it is that kind of dialogical nature that we're talking about, and being able to zoom in to the details, but also zoom out. Can you talk a little bit more about that kind of his maintaining the identity of architect and why that's important both to him and kind of self identity, but also to his writing?
I think for for Ken, architecture's boundaries are, as we've been saying, are very expansive, and I think they extend outward in two directions. I mean, first is this real concern that with how buildings are real things that
Right.
are
Yeah.
put together, yeah, um, with craft and with care and with details and with a deep appreciation for the nature of materials. So I think there's this sense that there's this kind of appreciation for the craftsman, for the artisan,
Mm.
and yet the other direction that he's pushing the boundaries of architecture is in this larger field of social and political responsibilities. And I think he sees that the architect has to deal with both of those things, that the architect has to, yeah, constantly be aware of the details of the real world, and the way that we encounter the life world in all of its messiness. And at the same time, there is that the vocation of the architect also means that you have to be engaged with the world,
Mm.
and that
Hmm.
brings with it political
Hmm.
implications.
I think that Kenneth realizes that buildings are enormous investments, irrespective of who's putting the money up front. It's an investment of a piece of the earth. It's an investment of money. It's an investment of energy. It's an investment of all manner of capital, and that irrespective of whether it's a private or a public project, that there is a kind of obligation in his way of seeing the practice, um, to attain the most kind of experiential um, uh, power or experiential sort of quality from the sort of least investment of all these resources of society. And his criticism is that there's a vast number of buildings that seem to go in the opposite direction. They invest huge amounts of resources in buildings that have virtually no impact on many people's lives, or at least not a beneficial impact,
Hmm.
which for him is just unethical. And there's an ethical sort of undercurrent that is really powerful, and that he admits to, even during a period when many critics were sort of suggesting that somehow architecture history had to be sort of neutral. It had to sort of step back and not be engaged and not be committing itself, so to speak, and just sort of be like a sort of a neutral coach or neutral referee or something,
Hmm.
which for
Hmm.
him is just not possible. It's not possible. He is not a bone of that in his body. I just think and it's what makes him so enjoyable to be around, because he has strong opinions about things, and when he phrases it, he always phrases it in a very constructive manner. So it's not
Mm.
just, oh, this is just no good. I mean, he might say that in private, but he wants to say it's no good, but I'm going to show you why, and I'm going to show you how it should be better, and I'm going to tell you why
Right.
it should be better. and I'll reference it with other examples because, of course, his range of
Yeah.
what he has available in his head is just well, Karla and I can attest to this from years of experience, but it's just extraordinary what he can hold in terms of if he gives a response to a question, it's encyclopedic. He can touch base to everything without any notes. And we know Karla and I have known of some instances where he's written some essays without notes on an airplane,
Oh, wow.
which have just blown us away when we were sort of when we saw the result. Some quite famous essays, I might say. So um, there's a power of concentration there, which that's perhaps Kenneth the writer. Um, but I think he never loses track of which is why we felt it was really important to put the word Lifeworld in the title, is that this it is a large concept. It's a super large concept. It's all encompassing, and that's exactly what architecture has to deal with. This is not an art. This is not a choice. This is not an art for the sake of art. This is a piece of work that people, not including the architect, have to grapple with for perhaps the rest of their lives. It's something that I, have come to emphasize with my students as well. I say, you're making things, and you will never have to suffer in this building, but you have to make it so the people who live there feel at least that their life is not made less powerful and less sort of rich. And Kenneth has always been pushing. It's never good enough. It's never good enough. And you can talk to some of the architects who he has, so to speak, promoted by publishing their work quite early, and he is a very difficult. He can be a very tough critic, especially on people who he feels to some degree he has been responsible for making more present in the larger world, because he publicized their work when they were young people. And I've been involved in several of those encounters, which were quite refreshing. And so he has a sense of loyalty, and people feel a certain loyalty to him, but he has a sense of loyalty to certain ideas and certain people as well.
Right.
But it's also this enormous sense of social responsibility, and that is not just a kind of catchphrase. It has to do with all the things that the social world is connected with, and so that's well, I don't know quite how to go further with that, but anyway.
Yeah, no. I love that, and I think that's a really nice way to kind of wrap up this conversation. So I'm going to ask you the last question. That is the question I used to end all of these conversations, and actually, in a weird way, brings this full circle, because we started the conversation talking about his belief in kind of the power of books and the amount of books that he's been involved in. And so I'm just curious, to wrap up, what are both of you reading right now?
Well, I'm part of a new world now, in that I'm teaching on the Navajo Nation, and I'm
Right.
very committed to trying to be a catalyst as a non-native for discussions that I think are at the heart of Ken Frampton's writings on critical regionalism, and certainly Paul Ricoeur's writings. And I think asking questions about what it means for my Navajo students to remain somehow grounded in their own cultural traditions, and at the same time be citizens of a globalized world. And it's a very delicate dance, and I've been working closely with someone named Ted Hohola, who is at the University of New Mexico, who's very interested in issues of indigenous design and planning. So I've been immersing myself in theories of the seven generation model, a very different way of
Right.
understanding landscape, understanding kinship, understanding the built environment in a totally different way from my Western European formation. So I have been reading work on concepts of the sacred and of landscape related to the native North American tribes.
I'm actually sort of neck deep in a huge second revised and expanded edition of my Lewis Kahn for Fiden. I just received something this morning I have to now look at when we finish this discussion. I think it's a preliminary layout. So, but it's going to be unbelievably, it's a 512-page book, and it's going to get bigger.
Wow.
But it's also an expanded format. But as a result of that, and that book was first published in 2005. I basically wrote it in 2003. So I've been doing a huge amount of reading up until this point that was related to that, because there's been a lot of material that's come out. But the thing I'm reading now, which is most interesting, is a biography, I guess you could call it a sort of intellectual biography of Leon Battista Alberti, written by Anthony Grafton, who's not an architect, who's a kind of cultural writer, particularly about medieval. But he has made me aware of the fact that an enormous number of sort of points of view or anecdotes that Kahn talked about or articulated actually could be traced back to Alberti, and it's not well known whether he wasn't a sort of prolific reader. Kahn wasn't, but he did have conversations with people, and then he would ask them their opinion about books, and then he would, as he said, he read the first page, and that's he was always interested in the beginning. But anyway, every time I sit down to tackle another chapter, I seem to come up with it, and I was like, oh, okay, so that's where that came from. And I mean, I've the House in the City and the City the House, that's clearly easily traced back to Alberti, but there's a number of others that have to do with the nature of monumentality and the nature of what is a quality product, and how the quality product doesn't have anything to do with the cost of the materials. It has to do with the skill and the craft that went into its making, which is almost a direct quote from Kahn's Monumentality, but it's also a direct quote from Alberti's Art of Painting, which I wasn't aware of until I was reading this. And the other book I'm reading is, and I don't remember the exact title, but it's a biography of the Austrian writer Anton Zweig, his last years after he was in exile. It was made into a movie, actually. It's quite a good book, but it sort of steers clear of the time frame which Zweig writes about in his autobiography, which is a fantastic autobiography. But he drops the autobiography about in the late 1930s, and then that's sort of where this is picked up, because he committed suicide in the 40s, living in Brazil, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I'm reading that, and I'm also reading a book that one of my friends referenced that I, quote, had to read because he's absolutely nuts about the Partisan Review. So it's called George Being George. It's about George Plimpton. It's just anecdotes about George Plimpton's life, which is just a riot, because I don't know how that guy got to know so many people. I mean, he's wired into everything. He's an amazing guy. So anyway, so at this point, I have to say, during the pandemic, I've lost count recently, but I was somewhere around 100 books that I had read since the beginning of I'm reading about 2 a week, because this forced isolation, I'm determined to make some good use of it, because I can't travel, I can't lecture, I can't do any of the things that I actually spend probably too much time doing. Can't teach overseas, which is what I was scheduled to do. And so I'm determined to my library has always stayed way ahead of my reading. That is, I buy more than I can read. Yeah. And I'm determined to try at least close the gap. I don't think I'm going to be able to close it completely, but I'm working on it. And
I love that.
And of course, when Karla and I were working on this book, we read quite a lot of. The essays were quite something for us to also read. Yeah, just sort of tailoring and sort of pushing a few people in one direction or another to make sure different issues got covered in the book was. It was interesting. I will not do another one. Someone else can do the next one, because this is about it for me.
I love that. I'm very jealous of your book reading over the pandemic. That was my goal also, and somehow I still feel like I don't have enough time. I just want to say that I loved this book as somebody, like I said, who's outside of architecture and was familiar with critical regionalism and the broad strokes of Frampton's work. It was so nice to spend time with this and put it in context and kind of understand his influence kind of so much better. And it was great talking to both of you about him and about the book and about kind of the evolution of architecture discourse, really. And I know you both mentioned that you did not want to talk too much about your own work, but you did kind of slip some things in at the end. So we should do this again, where we can talk about some of your other projects a bit. But thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you.
This episode was recorded on December 21st, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.